Someone in your group has wronged you. Maybe they took more than their share. Maybe they were given something you deserved. Maybe they went behind your back or looked too long at the person you love. And right now, sitting in your chest is a hot and specific feeling. Anger, resentment, that bitter acidic thing we call jealousy. You know what happens next in your world. You complain to a friend. You send a passive-aggressive message. In the worst case, someone calls a lawyer or the police. There are systems. There are rules written down. There are people whose entire job is to step between you and the person you're angry at. Now take all of that away. You are in a band of 30 people. There are no police, no courts, no prisons, no written laws, no government of any kind. There is no one to appeal to nowhere, to file a complaint, and no authority above you. And you cannot leave because leaving means walking alone into a landscape that will kill you within days. You will see this person tomorrow, and the next day, and every day for the rest of your life. So what happens? What actually stops? 30 people trapped together with no rules and no referee from tearing each other apart over jealousy and grudges and wounded pride. The answer is one of the most sophisticated systems humans have ever built. It has 5 escalating stages. It operated for tens of thousands of years, and its final stage will genuinely shock you. And by the end of this, you'll understand why the ugliest habit you have might be the single most important social technology our species ever invented. Let's go back. First, we have to clear away a fantasy because it's stopping people from seeing what's really remarkable here. There's a comfortable story that ancient humans lived in peaceful harmony, and that conflict is something civilization invented. That story is wrong, and the bones prove it. At a site called Jebel Sahaba in the Nile Valley of Sudan, archaeologists excavated a cemetery holding the remains of 61 people dating back somewhere between 13 and 14,000 years. A full modern reanalysis of those bones found over 100 previously undocumented injuries. Stone projectile points still embedded in the skeletons. Fractures. Wounds everywhere. But the detail that matters most is this. Among 41 of those individuals, more than 67% researchers found both healed and unhealed injuries on the same person. Healed means they were attacked, survived, and recovered. Unhealed means a later attack killed them. That single fact rewrites the story. This wasn't one battle. These were people who lived through violence, healed, and were attacked again. The pattern points to repeated raids and ambushes stretching across decades. And it isn't isolated. At Nataruk near Lake Turkana in Kenya, the remains of 27 hunter-gatherers were found dating to around 10,000 years ago. 12 show fatal injuries, crushing blows to the skull, arrow wounds, and in some cases, evidence that their hands had been bound. These were not warriors from some organized army. They were a foraging band, including women and children, and something terrible happened to them all at once. Go back further still, and you find a partial skeleton at Wadi Kubanaya in Egypt, roughly 20,000 years old, carrying what appears to be the oldest documented evidence of interpersonal violence we have. So, let's be honest. Ancient humans were not gentle. They got jealous, they held grudges, they fought, and sometimes they killed each other. But here's what makes that fact interesting rather than depressing. If the potential for violence was always there and there were no police and no courts, then something must have been holding it back most of the time. Because these bands survived. For tens of thousands of years, small groups of humans lived at close quarters day after day with all the ordinary human ugliness intact, and they did not collapse. Something was working. And when anthropologists finally looked closely at it, they found something far more organized than anyone expected. The person who mapped it most clearly was an evolutionary anthropologist named Christopher Boehm. He surveyed dozens of forager societies, looking specifically at how they handled the person who becomes a problem. The bully, the hoarder, the boaster, the one who takes more than their share or tries to push others around. And what he found was not chaos. It was a ladder, a precise escalating sequence of social punishments applied in order, each one heavier than the last. It ran from the gentlest possible correction all the way to something genuinely chilling. Let's climb it one rung at a time. The first rung is the one you use every single day and almost certainly feel a little guilty about. Gossip. We treat gossip as a petty vice, something small-minded people do. But look at what it actually accomplishes in a small group with no formal authority. Someone behaves badly. They take an unfair share of meat, or they're cruel to someone weaker, or they've started acting like they're better than everyone else. Nobody confronts them directly. Instead, over the following days, the story travels. It moves between two people gathering firewood, three people sitting by the fire, a mother and daughter walking to water. And by the time it has finished moving, something enormous has happened. 30 people who never held a meeting now share the same opinion about that person's behavior. A group verdict has formed quietly, without anyone declaring anything. This is where gossip stops looking petty and starts looking like infrastructure. Boehm's research describes exactly this. The maintenance of the social order begins with gossip about behavior that seems threatening or unfair, and escalates from there only when necessary. Gossip is the censor network. It's how a group with no leader develops a shared position, and it does it with almost no risk to anyone involved. There's a striking detail in Boehm's work about how deliberate this could be. When a band was dealing with a genuinely dangerous individual, people would confer in small groups behind that person's back, gradually building a consensus without ever alerting them to what was being decided. That is not idle chatter. That is a group deliberately and carefully assembling a judgment while keeping the accused from realizing a decision is forming. And crucially, gossip does its most important work before anything bad happens, because everyone knows their reputation is constantly being discussed. That knowledge alone shapes behavior. When you cannot escape the people who talk about you being talked about badly is expensive. There's a deeper evolutionary argument here that makes gossip look even more important. Our closest primate relatives maintain their social bonds physically by grooming each other, picking through fur for hours a day. It works, but it has a hard ceiling. You can only groom one individual at a time, so there's a limit to how large a group you can hold together that way. Humans blew past that limit. And one influential idea in evolutionary anthropology is that language, and specifically the social talk we call gossip, is what let us do it. Talking about other people lets you maintain relationships with many individuals at once, and lets you learn about someone's character without ever having interacted with them directly. You can find out that a person is unreliable from someone who found out the hard way. Under that view, gossip isn't a degraded side effect of language. It may be close to the reason language became so valuable in the first place. The thing we're most embarrassed about doing might be the thing that let human groups grow beyond the size an ape can manage. But sometimes gossip isn't enough. So, the ladder goes up a rung. And the second rung is one of the most brilliant social inventions I know of. Ridicule. Not cruelty, not violence. Mockery. Teasing. Being laughed at. The most famous example comes from the hoansi people of the Kalahari, documented by the anthropologist Richard Lee, and it is a small masterpiece of social engineering. It's called insulting the meat. Here's how it works. A hunter goes out and brings down a large animal. This is genuinely wonderful news. The whole band will eat well for days. He has done something difficult and valuable, and everyone knows it. So when he returns, everyone tells him the kill is pathetic. They complain that the animal is thin, that it's barely worth the walk, that they came all this way for a bag of bones. They make a show of being disappointed. And the hunter is expected to agree with them, to be modest and dismissive about his own achievement. Now this looks bizarre until you understand what it's preventing. A successful hunter has power. He controls a resource everyone needs. If he were praised the way he deserved, he would begin to feel important. And someone who feels important starts expecting deference, starts taking a larger share, starts giving orders. That is exactly how a group of equals turns into a group with a boss. The hoansi understood this danger perfectly. Lee recorded their explanation directly. They insult the meat precisely so that a successful hunter does not become proud, because a proud man eventually starts to see the rest of the band as beneath him. So they built a ritual that lets a man succeed without letting him rise. He gets the food, the group gets the meat, and nobody gets a king. And it's done with laughter, which means no one has to accuse anyone of anything. Look at what's actually happening on that deeper level. Boehm's term for this whole phenomenon is the reverse dominance hierarchy. His argument is that humans didn't abolish dominance because the impulse to dominate is deeply built into us. We share it with chimpanzees. What our ancestors did instead was invert it. The group as a whole became the dominant force and used its collective weight to suppress any individual who tried to rise above the rest. That's an extraordinary idea. Equality among these people was not the natural default that happens when nobody has much. Equality was a construction. It required constant, active maintenance. Every day in small ways, the group pushed down anyone who started to swell. And ridicule was the everyday tool that did it. But some people don't take a hint. So the ladder goes up again. Rung 3 is direct confrontation, talking it out in public. Among the Jew, hoansi, there's a form of this that Lee described in detail, and it is nothing like the calm mediation you might imagine. It's loud. It's a public argument, sometimes furious, where grievances are dragged into the open in front of everyone. People say exactly what they think of each other. Old resentments come out. And this is not considered a failure. It's considered the process working. Because in a band this size, a private grudge is a poison. Two people quietly hating each other will infect every hunting party, every meal, every decision. Better to have it out in front of everyone and let the group's collective opinion press down on both parties at once. What's remarkable is how these confrontations often ended. Lee observed that the shouting frequently turned, sometimes quite suddenly, from anger into laughter and joking once the tension had been released. Humor was the escape hatch. It let two people who had just screamed at each other step back down into being neighbors again. Sit with that for a moment. Public conflict held in front of everyone with laughter as the exit ramp. Compare it to the modern alternative. Two people who never say anything directly exchanging cold silences for 20 years. But some conflicts are too deep to talk out. And this is where the system does something we've almost entirely lost the ability to do. Rung 4. You leave. Anthropologists call it fission. When two people or two families simply cannot resolve their conflict, one of them packs up and goes to live with a different camp for a few weeks, a few months, or forever. There's a lovely detail in the ethnography of the Jew, hoansi. When a family announces they're leaving to visit their kin, everyone understands what that actually means. They aren't getting along and they need distance. Lee described this as an excellent form of conflict resolution and pointed out exactly why it works for people like the Jew. Hoansi, because they have very little investment in fixed property, it's easier for them to split up, temporarily, than to stay locked together in a bad argument. That last part is the key, and it's worth pausing on. Their ability to walk away came directly from owning almost nothing. No house, no land, no stored wealth. Everything they had they could carry, which means their most powerful conflict resolution tool was a direct product of their poverty and possessions. Because they owned nothing, they were free. Because they were free, they could leave. And because they could leave, no conflict had to escalate to violence. This connects to something researchers have identified across multiple African hunter-gatherer groups. Studies of these societies have found a consistent set of mechanisms that sustain their equality, and the very first one on the list is residential mobility, the ability to move. Alongside it, broad access to resources and information. Widespread sharing, non-coercive leadership decisions made by consensus, rather than command and active enforcement of social norms. Notice that these are not passive conditions. They are practices upheld deliberately day after day. Equality wasn't something that happened to these people. It was something they did. Two of those mechanisms deserve a closer look because they prevented conflicts from forming in the first place. The first is non-coercive leadership. These bands did have leaders in a sense, but leadership meant influence rather than authority. A respected hunter or an experienced elder was listened to, but they could not give orders. And the qualities people looked for in such a person are revealing in Boehm's material desirable leaders are often described in terms of what they lack. Not overbearing, not boastful, not aloof. Praise itself was rationed carefully precisely because too much of it might make its target arrogant. The second is consensus decision-making. Rather than a leader deciding and the rest complying, groups talked until they arrived at something everyone could accept. This is slow and often frustrating. But it means that when a decision is finally made, nobody has been overruled and there is no accumulated resentment waiting to surface later. A great deal of conflict in our world comes from people being forced to live with decisions they had no part in making. These bands largely designed that problem out. But what happens when someone won't be shamed, won't talk, and won't leave? What happens when a person is genuinely dangerous? The latter has two more rungs, and they get dark. Rung 5 is ostracism. And to understand why this was so devastating, you have to stop thinking of it as the social awkwardness of being left out of a group chat. In a band of 30 people in a harsh landscape, other people are your food supply, your defense, your medicine, your childcare, your warmth at night, and your only source of everything you need to stay alive. There is no alternative group down the road. There is no going it alone. Being cut off from the group was not an emotional injury. It was a physical threat. Ostracism meant the shared meat might not reach you. The information about where the water had moved might not reach you. In a real sense, it was a slow death sentence carried out by silence. And your brain knows this, which is one of the most striking findings in modern psychology. Research on social exclusion has found that being rejected activates some of the same neural regions involved in processing physical pain. That's not a poetic metaphor. Your nervous system appears to treat social exclusion as a genuine emergency because for almost all of human history it was one. That is also why shame feels so unbearable. Why a bad reputation can feel physically sickening. These feelings are calibrated to a world where exclusion could kill you, and they are still running at full strength in a world where it usually can't. Then there's the final rung, and this is the one that surprises almost everyone. Execution. Boehm documented across a wide sample of these societies that when an individual became a genuine and repeated threat to the group, and every other measure had failed, the band would sometimes kill him. Not in a fight. Not in anger. As a collective decision. It shows up again and again in his research. A man among the Baruya who took his neighbor's livestock and forced their wives into sex was killed by his own people. In other societies described in the same body of work, wealthy men who refused to be generous were reprimanded, ostracized, and sometimes executed. And these killings had a specific character. They were usually collective, deliberate, and often carried out by close kin of the offender, which reduced the risk of triggering a blood feud between families. This was not hot-blooded murder. It was in the most literal sense, capital punishment, a group with no laws deciding together that a person could not remain among the living. That is the top of the ladder. Gossip, ridicule, confrontation, departure, ostracism, execution. Now, we have to be honest about where this system failed, because it failed often and it failed badly, particularly with the emotion we started with, jealousy. Lee's work in the Doab region of the Kalahari documented 22 homicides. And here's the detail that should stop you: 15 of those were connected to blood feuds. Revenge killings chaining one death to the next. In the nearby Nye area, 9 people were killed over the course of a feud that ran for about 20 years. And the origin of that feud was a dispute over marriage negotiations that went badly. Read that again. 9 deaths, 2 decades of violence sparked by a conflict over who would marry whom. That's what the system couldn't handle. And notice that fission, the great escape valve, failed here specifically. When a killing has happened, walking away doesn't end it, because both sides are determined to be the one who struck last. The grudge follows. And this points at something honest about human conflict. The system was good at economic disputes and status disputes. Someone taking too much meat, someone acting superior. Those had clear remedies. But sexual jealousy and marriage disputes cut into something the latter couldn't reach. Boehm identified exactly this as the striking anomaly in the whole picture. Hunter-gatherer homicide was quite frequent, and it usually arose from male competition, often over women. So no, this was not a solved problem. These people had a genuinely impressive system, and it still could not fully contain the oldest and hottest human emotion. Now let's get underneath all of it, because there are 2 mechanisms running here, and understanding them changes how you see your own feelings. The first is biological, and it starts with the question of why jealousy exists at all. Jealousy feels like a malfunction. It's painful, it makes you behave badly, and it rarely helps. But it's universal, it appears across every human culture, and it's ancient. Evolution does not usually maintain something that expensive without a reason. The reason is that, in the world your ancestors lived in, jealousy was an alarm system, and it was monitoring the 2 things that mattered most for survival. The first was resources. In a band where food was shared, an unfair distribution wasn't an insult. It was a threat to your survival and your children. The feeling that rises when someone takes more than their share is your nervous system flagging a genuine danger. The second was relationships. Your mate and your allies were your entire support structure. Losing a partner to a rival or losing your closest ally's loyalty was a catastrophic loss of security. Jealousy is the alarm that fires when that structure is threatened. So the feeling in your chest right now when you see someone else get what you wanted is not a character flaw. It's a several 100,000-year-old detection system doing precisely what it evolved to do, telling you that something important might be slipping away. And there's a second related piece of hardware: your sense of fairness. Humans are intensely sensitive to unequal treatment, and we react to it with real emotion. This makes no sense from a purely selfish standpoint, but perfect sense in a group that survives by sharing. A creature that can detect and object to being cheated is a creature that can maintain cooperation. Our fairness instinct is what makes the whole system possible, and it is also what makes us miserable when we feel wronged. The second mechanism is psychological, and it's the reason the latter actually worked. The entire structure rests on one thing: reputation. Not force, not law, reputation. In a band of 30, everyone knows everything about you. There is no version of you that other people can't see. Your reputation is built from every action you have ever taken in front of witnesses who remember all of it, and it will follow you for your entire life. That total visibility is the engine. It's what makes gossip powerful because there is no escaping being talked about. It's what makes ridicule effective because you have to face those people tomorrow. It's what makes ostracism lethal because there's nowhere else to go. And that's why the latter rarely needed its upper rungs. Most people never had to be shamed or exiled because the mere knowledge that these things existed applied by people you would see every day forever shaped behavior before it went wrong. The system's real power wasn't punishment. It was the certainty of being known. Which brings us to the twist, and it's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. We look back at these people and see a world without institutions. No police, no courts, no laws, and we assume they were simply doing without. But that's backwards. They weren't missing a justice system. They had one so effective, so continuously running, so woven into every hour of daily life that it needed no buildings, no officials, no writing, and no enforcement arm at all. It ran entirely on human attention and human memory. And then we built cities. And every part of it broke. Because every rung on that ladder depended on the same foundation, a small group of people who all know each other and cannot escape each other. Take that away and the whole structure collapses. In a city, gossip loses its power, because the person you're gossiping about will never meet the people hearing it. Ridicule loses its power, because you can simply avoid the people who mock you. Ostracism loses its teeth because there are a million other people down the road. And leaving stops being a release valve, because you have a house, a job, a lease, possessions you cannot carry. Every one of the tools our ancestors used to regulate each other was disabled by scale, by anonymity, and by property. So we had to build replacements from scratch: written laws, police courts, prisons. Formal institutions staffed and funded doing badly and expensively what a functioning band did continuously and for free. And notice what we gave up in the exchange. Their system was applied by people who knew the offender personally, who understood the whole history behind an incident, and who had to keep living alongside that person afterward. That last part mattered enormously. Because you would see this person tomorrow, the goal was almost never to destroy them. It was to correct them and keep them in the group. Even the harshest rungs of the ladder existed to restore the balance, not to satisfy a craving for punishment. Our replacements have no such incentive. A court does not have to live with the person it sentences. A stranger condemning someone online will never meet them. We inherited the appetite for judgment without inheriting the responsibility that used to come attached to it. And here is the part that should really land. The instincts didn't go anywhere. You still have the full set. The jealousy alarm, the rage at unfairness, the compulsion to talk about people who behave badly, the devastating sensitivity to exclusion. All of it intact, running the same ancient software in a world it was never designed for. Think about what that means for how we live now. Our ancestors' gossip had a natural break built into it, because you had to say things to someone's face eventually, and you had to live with the consequences. Now we have a version of gossip that reaches millions of strangers instantly about people we will never meet, with no break at all. The mechanism is identical. The safeguards are gone. And our exclusion alarm, calibrated for a world where being cut off meant death, now fires constantly over things that cannot actually hurt us. A message left unanswered, a group photo we weren't in. The pain is real because the alarm is real. It's just no longer measuring anything that threatens our survival. So think back to that moment we started with. Someone in your group has wronged you, and there's a hot feeling in your chest. You are not experiencing a personal failing. You are running an ancient program, one that once helped 30 people share meat fairly and keep any one person from becoming a tyrant. That feeling built our species' first justice system. It kept our ancestors alive, and it kept them equal through 100,000 years of sitting around fires with people they could not escape. They were not simple people muddling through without rules. They had built something extraordinary, a system with 5 escalating stages, applied with judgment, capable of correcting a bully with a joke, and when it truly had to, of removing a killer by collective decision. They ran it without writing anything down, without appointing anyone to enforce it, and without ever calling it a system at all. And they did it while carrying exactly the same jealousy, the same wounded pride, the same grudges you carry right now. The next time you feel that specific bitter heat towards someone in your life, you might recognize it for what it is. Not a flaw in your character, an inheritance. The same signal that once told a hunter-gatherer that something in the group had gone out of balance and needed attention. Your ancestors felt exactly what you're feeling. Then they sat down by the fire with the person who caused it and figured out how to live beside them anyway. That's the part we're still trying to relearn.